The JonBenét Ramsey case. The evidence no one talks about. There is a piece of evidence sitting in an American crime lab right now that has never been fully run through the same technology that caught the Golden State Killer. It belongs to a case that is almost 30 years old, involves a 6-year-old girl, and has been picked apart by more amateur detectives than almost any murder in modern history. And yet, somehow, the one tool that has cracked hundreds of cold cases since 2018 was barely used on this one. That's not a theory. That's a documented fact. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why that happened, and why unsolved might be the most misleading word anyone has ever used to describe this case. This is the story of JonBenét Ramsey. Not the tabloid version, not the pageant tapes, not the endless cable news shouting matches from the early 2000s. This is the version built on the actual paper trail, the autopsy report, the grand jury records that stayed sealed for 14 years, the DNA findings, and the mistakes made in the first 24 hours that no one has ever been able to undo. It is a case that was never as mysterious as we were told. It was simply mishandled, argued over, and left to rot in a jurisdictional limbo while the technology to potentially resolve it kept improving in the background and used. Let's start with what the case actually looked like from the outside, because that context matters. In December of 1996, Boulder, Colorado, was about as far from a murder capital as an American city could get. It was a college town, quiet, wealthy in patches, the kind of place where violent crime was rare enough that a single homicide could dominate local news for a year. Into that setting, on the morning after Christmas, came a phone call to 911 from a mother who said her daughter was missing and that she'd found a note. The family at the center of it had, on paper, nothing that looked like tragedy waiting to happen. A successful business executive father. A mother who had once competed in pageants herself and had survived a serious cancer diagnosis a few years earlier. An older brother, 9 years old. And JonBenét, 6 years old, a kindergartner who had, like her mother before her, spent some of her early childhood in children's pageants. Those pageant videos would later become the most replayed images in the entire case, endlessly recut on television, until most of the country had a picture of a girl in stage makeup instead of a picture of an actual 6-year-old who rode her bike and liked being with her family. The night before the murder had been ordinary. A Christmas party at a friend's house. A late drive home. A tired child carried up to bed. The family was scheduled to fly out early the next morning for a trip. Nothing about that night suggested anything except an early wake-up call ahead. And then, sometime in the hours that followed, the coroner would later place the window somewhere between late that night and the very early morning. JonBenét was killed inside her own home. Here is the detail that has never stopped bothering investigators, no matter which theory they favor. There was no clear evidence of forced entry into that house. No broken window that couldn't be otherwise explained. No reported sound of a struggle. Nothing that woke anyone else sleeping under that same roof. Whatever happened, happened quietly, in a house occupied by 3 other people, on a residential street, in a town that averaged only a handful of homicides a year. That single fact is the reason this case split into 2 irreconcilable camps almost immediately, and neither camp has ever been able to fully explain away the other side's strongest point. Now let's talk about the note, because the note is where this case stops looking like a normal crime and starts looking like something almost impossible to categorize. It was found on a staircase the next morning, 2.5 pages, close to 400 words, written by hand. It claimed JonBenét was being held by a group demanding money, gave instructions not to contact police, and threatened her life if those instructions weren't followed. On the surface, that sounds like a kidnapping. But almost nothing about the note behaves like a real ransom note. Real ransom notes, the kind investigators actually encounter in genuine kidnapping cases, tend to be short. They're prepared ahead of time. They're built for speed because the person writing them wants to get in, leave the message, and get out. This note did the opposite. It rambled. It read almost like it was written by someone who'd absorbed a little too much crime fiction, full of lines that felt performed rather than functional. And critically, both the notepad and the pen used to write it were traced back to items already inside the house. Nobody brought supplies to that crime scene. Somebody sat down, in the dark, in a house where a child had just been killed, and spent what investigators estimate could have been 20 minutes to nearly an hour handwriting a multi-page letter. Think about what that timeline actually implies. If a stranger broke into that home, killed a child, and then chose to stay for the better part of an hour composing a lengthy letter on the homeowner's own stationery, while risking discovery the entire time, that is an extraordinarily unusual choice for anyone trying to escape a crime scene undetected. And there's a second problem baked into the note itself. It demands a ransom for a hostage, but the victim's body never left the house. You don't leave a ransom note for someone you didn't actually take anywhere. Then there's the number. The note asked for a specific amount of money, not a round figure, not an amount scaled to an executive's full net worth, but a strangely precise sum. When investigators looked into it, they found that figure closely matched a bonus the father had recently received from his company. That's not public information. That's not something you'd guess from outside the family. It's the kind of detail that exists inside a household's private financial conversations. Whoever wrote that note appears to have known something specific and personal about the family's finances, which raises an uncomfortable question that the case has never fully answered. How would an outside intruder know that number? So, from the very first piece of evidence recovered, the case was already pulling in two directions at once. Toward an outsider whose behavior didn't match how outsiders actually behave in a kidnapping, or toward someone with intimate access to the household who was, in the chaos of that morning, constructing a story. And then came the hours that followed, which turned out to be almost as consequential as the crime itself. Because when police arrived, they were responding to what looked like a kidnapping, a live hostage situation, not a homicide. And that distinction shaped everything that happened next. The house was not sealed as a murder scene, because as far as anyone knew in those first hours, the murder hadn't happened there. The front door stayed open. Friends, a minister, and victim advocates were let inside to comfort a family in crisis. People made coffee. People sat on furniture, opened doors, touched surfaces, every one of them doing exactly what compassionate people do in the worst hour of someone else's life, and every one of them, without meaning to, quietly erasing the very evidence a homicide investigation would eventually need. Understaffing made it worse. Boulder's police department, built for a town where violent crime was rare, was not equipped to run a fast-moving, high-profile investigation the moment it started. For a critical stretch of that morning, a single detective was effectively managing the entire scene alone, trying to comfort a family, coordinate with a department still expecting a ransom call, and somehow also preserve evidence in a home that was rapidly filling with well-meaning visitors. The investigators had reason to hope, at first, that the note was genuine because the note itself had promised a phone call, instructions for a ransom drop between 8 and 10 that morning. So they waited. They rigged the phone to trace an incoming call, and the house held its breath through those 2 hours. The call never came. And when that window closed with only silence, the story the note had built began to fall apart in real time, because a kidnapper who never calls to collect a ransom isn't behaving like a kidnapper at all. By early afternoon, the investigation was stuck in a strange kind of limbo, not confirmed as anything except a missing child with a note that was starting to look less and less credible. It was in that vacuum that a decision was made that would be picked apart for decades afterward. The lead detective on scene asked the father and a family friend to search the house themselves, room by room, for anything unusual. It's important to say plainly what that decision was. Asking someone who had not yet been ruled out as a person of interest to search the very rooms that might hold the evidence, without a trained investigator present to observe or preserve what was found. In a fully staffed, textbook investigation, that never happens. But this wasn't a textbook investigation. It was one overwhelmed department, in a house that had already been compromised for hours, trying to make a decision under conditions nobody there had been trained for. That search ended in the basement, in a small windowless room most people in that house probably walked past 100 times without a second thought. JonBenét's body was there. What happened in the minutes after that discovery is, forensically speaking, one of the most damaging sequences in the entire case, not because of malice, but because of the rawest, most human reaction imaginable. The scene was disturbed. The body was moved, carried upstairs, before it could be examined and documented exactly as it had been left. And once that happens, it cannot be undone. No photograph, no expert reconstruction, no amount of later analysis can put a crime scene back the way it was before someone touched it. By the end of that first day, the two things any homicide investigation depends on most, an untouched scene and an undisturbed body, were both already gone. Not erased by a killer covering tracks, but worn away by the accumulated weight of shock, grief, and ordinary human instinct. What the autopsy eventually revealed only deepened the case's central, unresolved question. JonBenét had suffered a severe skull fracture, significant enough, according to forensic testimony, to have caused instant unconsciousness, and she had also been strangled, with a cord tied to a broken handle from an artist's paintbrush found among household art supplies. Two injuries, either one potentially fatal on its own. And investigators have spent nearly 3 decades unable to agree on which came first, because the order changes the entire nature of the crime. If the head injury came first as an accident or a sudden act of rage, then the strangulation that followed could be read as an attempt to disguise what had already happened. If the strangulation was the intended method from the start, that points towards something far more calculated and predatory. Experts have argued this for years without resolution, and you cannot close a case when the experts can't even agree on what kind of crime occurred. For a long time, statistics pointed the investigation inward, the way they usually do in cases where a child dies inside a home with no clear forced entry. Households are, unfortunately, where investigators most often have to start looking first. One lead detective became so convinced of that theory that he eventually resigned from the case and later argued for it publicly. But then lab work complicated that picture significantly. DNA recovered from JonBenét's clothing, later confirmed at more than one location using newer testing methods, belonged to an unidentified male. It didn't match her father, her mother, her brother, or any of the family friends who were tested. To this day, it has never been definitively matched to anyone. To people who believe an intruder was responsible, that DNA is the clearest physical evidence in the entire case, a genetic signature from someone who has never been identified, sitting in a national database for decades. To skeptics, it's potentially explainable by contamination, possibly introduced before the clothing ever reached the family. That single disagreement, more than any other piece of evidence, is why this case has never been able to move past open speculation into a resolved conclusion. And this is where the story stops being just about a crime and starts being about a system. Because in 2006, a man confessed to the murder from overseas, and for a few frantic days, headlines around the world declared the case solved. His DNA didn't match. His detailed knowledge turned out to be pulled from years of publicly available reporting on the case. He was cleared within days. That false alarm actually demonstrated something important. The DNA testing that existed at the time was good enough to rule someone out almost immediately. It simply was never systematically used to rule someone in. Because here's the part of this story that gets lost in every rehash of pageant photos and note theories. The technology to potentially move this case forward already exists, and has existed for years. Forensic genetic genealogy. The process of taking a DNA profile from a crime scene and comparing it against public genealogy databases to build outward through family trees is the exact method that identified the Golden State Killer in 2018, decades after his crimes. It has since been credited with helping resolve several hundred other cold cases across the country. And for most of that time, the unidentified male DNA profile from this case sat in a federal system without being run through that same genealogical process. Officials over the years have cited a range of real, procedural reasons: degraded sample quality, chain of custody requirements, the need to coordinate across multiple agencies, including the FBI. Those aren't necessarily illegitimate concerns. But while other families were getting phone calls that their decades-old cases had finally moved forward, this one largely didn't, year after year, even as the technology kept improving. Even the grand jury process reflected this pattern of an investigation that seemed to stall rather than conclude. In 1999, a Colorado grand jury reviewed the evidence for months, and the public was told there wasn't enough to bring charges against anyone. That statement, it turned out, wasn't the full picture. In 2013, after a journalist successfully sued to unseal the grand jury's records, it became public that the jurors had actually voted to indict, not for murder, but for lesser charges related to child abuse resulting in death. The district attorney at the time chose not to sign that indictment forward, and the full reasoning behind that decision has never been fully explained. For 14 years, the public believed no one on that jury had found enough to act on. The truth was more complicated and more uncomfortable. By the time a 2024 documentary reignited public attention on the case, and the surviving family renewed calls for updated testing, Boulder investigators announced they were pursuing new advanced DNA analysis in partnership with the FBI. Where that leads is still unknown. It could confirm a stranger was responsible, finally closing one of the most debated arguments in the case. It could point towards someone with a connection to the household, reopening every question about how that connection was missed for so long. Or it could come back inconclusive, leaving the case essentially where it has stood for almost 3 decades. What's clear, though, is that this was never really an unsolvable mystery in the way it's so often described. It was a solvable case that got buried early, under a chaotic first day, an overwhelmed department, a note that confused everyone about what kind of crime they were even looking at, and then for years afterward under jurisdictional caution and unused technology. The mystery was never really about whether the evidence existed. It was about whether anyone was going to consistently use it. So here's the question worth sitting with. If that DNA had been run through modern genealogy databases the very first year that method existed, do you think we'd already have an answer? And more importantly, what does it say about how the rest of us should be thinking about cold cases everywhere, not just this one, when the tools to solve them exist and simply aren't always used? Let me know what you think in the comments.